Let me kick off with a famous quote. Two nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by a different breeding, fed by different food, ordered by different manners, and not governed by the same laws. You speak, wrote Disraeli, of the Remainers and the Leavers. Of course, he didn't say that. It was 1845, and it was the depth of the social division between the rich and the poor, which the ambitious young novelist was exploring in his novel Sybil, subtitled The Two Nations. Yet, I think that famous passage in this Condition of England novel, which helped Disraeli begin his own ascent to become a future Prime Minister, does shed some useful light on tonight's theme of social relations in Britain after Brexit. Firstly, that he coined the idea of one nation in that era and that society reminds us this theme hasn't resonated most across the generations when society feels confident and at ease with itself. I think this concern for social cohesion is more compelling when we become uncomfortably aware that we're a more divided society than we have imagined ourselves to be. And secondly, I think that passage captures how the material facts are only one part of the story of a social divide. Now, Disraeli was writing about a Britain which much starker gulfs in income and wealth and certainly educational opportunity than our own. But he captured how those measurable socioeconomic differences are just one part of the story of a social divide. It's the lack of contact, no intercourse and no sympathy, the lack of empathy, the ignorance of the habits, thoughts and feelings of the other tribe that hardens and deepens a sense of mutual animosity, a feeling of them and us. Now, Disraeli wrote at a time when the invention of the railway was about to transform people's sense of distance and time, because it probably, ran on time in those days as well. But our world has sped up, become much more hyper-connected. In other ways, even in this hyper-connected world, we find new ways to be dwellers in different zones, geographically or online. So we can end up debating big questions like what happens now after Brexit, not just in a spirit of democratic disagreement, but sometimes ever-increasing mutual incomprehension, as if we were inhabitants of different planets. So the choices now facing Brexit Britain might look very different from planet Leave and planet Remain. And Professor Kaufman will be illustrating many of those differences and presenting data on them, how that referendum did divide the country by class, by income, by education and worldview, illuminating, of course, long-standing differences which were there before 2016. So those are real and important differences. But I just want to do something a bit different in talking to you as well, to look through the other end of the telescope and actually say that sometimes planet Remain and planet Leave might be fewer light years apart than we sometimes tell ourselves, because I think there are several ways in which the political and media debate about these real divisions in Britain after the referendum can risk oversimplifying, caricaturing and exaggerating them. Think about how we talk about place. There were very different referendum results across the nations of regions of Britain. So we talk in a shorthand that people voted Remain in Scotland and Northern Ireland and in London, but Wales and England voted to leave with majorities for Brexit in each of the English regions outside the capital. Sunderland, because it voted first, it declared first on the night, has become synonymous with Brexit, along with Stoke-on-Trent having its by-election now. And what tends to get written out and forgotten in this script is the 1 in 3 people in Sunderland and Stoke who thought it was better to stay in, the 4 out of 10 in London and Scotland who voted to leave. London actually contributed more of the votes because of its population size to the 17.4 million votes for Brexit than the North East did. Now, the poor people of Boston and Lincolnshire, they can barely step out of their front doors these days without tripping over a camera crew from the national, sometimes the international media, conducting a new anthropological study of how Britain voted to leave, often contrasting them with their fellow citizens in Cambridge or Islington who are still scratching their heads and can't really quite believe how the result came out how it did. And I think this strong focus on the tiny number of places where there would have been a Leave or Remain landslide, where it was 3-1 in the vote, rather obscures how almost all of us live in places that were somewhere in between. So the real story of finding out why Britain voted as it did would be better explained, I think, in all of the 52-48 places that can be found right around the country. You can find results that are quite close to the national result in Stratford-upon-Avon and in Swansea in South Wales, in Knowsley in Merseyside and North Somerset, from Bedford to Basingstoke, where, with a very pleasing mathematical symmetry, about 100,000 valid votes were cast, and when they counted them up, the 48,000 who'd voted to stay in were pipped by the 52,000 who voted to leave. It's very striking how few commentators see Basingstoke, rather than Boston, as the place that might better sum up the hopes and anxieties now of Brexit Britain. Also, how we talk about class. There's no doubt at all that class was very important in this referendum. Low-skilled, semi-skilled workers much more likely to vote to leave than middle-class professionals. And actually, the referendum was decided, much to David Cameron's disappointment, by disengaged voters who saw this referendum as a big enough reason to return to the ballot box when they'd rather got out of the habit of voting. The British election study data suggests Remain was just over 50% with the voters who cast a vote in the 2015 general election, but it was another 3 million voters who turned up for the referendum, boosting the turnout from 65% to 72% that tipped the result to a narrow win for Leave. So certainly left behind voters played a crucial role in this referendum, but that explanation has also been exaggerated. The 17.4 million were not all left behind voters protesting economic and cultural change over the last several decades. We've had so much focus on the 1 in 3 Labour voters who voted to leave, often without noting that quite a similar proportion actually of Liberal Democrat and Green and SNP voters voted to leave as well, and surprisingly little on the 6 in 10 Conservative voters who voted to leave at the same time. For David Cameron would have won that referendum, saved his job as Prime Minister, had he managed to persuade just 50% of those who'd backed his party in the general election just a year before. That he got only 40% of the Conservative 2015 vote proved fatal for him. So he didn't lose that referendum gamble to the left behind alone, but to a coalition of the left behind and the pretty well-heeled as well. The Leave campaign won a majority of vote in 3/4 of Labour-held seats and 3/4 of Conservative-held constituencies. The voters of Stoke and Sunderland were teaming up with those in Hampshire and Surrey to win the national result. Also, identity and ethnicity. Again, the vote divided Britain by identity and ethnicity. Those with the stronger sense of English rather than British identity were more likely to vote Leave. Ethnic minority Britons chose to stay in by a margin of about 2 to 1. Now, in my view, this was largely a default vote. There was too often, I think, a sense of unearned entitlement to these votes from the Remain side, because pro-Europeans have done very, very little to engage ethnic minority voters in the European argument over several decades. But they did benefit, I think, by default from mistrust in some of the most vocal anti-immigration voices on the Leave side. Many of these voters would have been pretty open to a sceptical argument about EU freedom of movement, if only they could have trusted the motives of those making that case. So in the end, the ethnic minority voted divided by class, by education, by place, like everyone else, weighing up what are the economic risks of leaving, what is the uncertainty of what Britain actually gets out for the payments it makes to the EU budget. But that 2 to 1 split, we often forget, suggests there were still about up to 1 million ethnic minority votes on the Leave side. And that was a reason Remain fell well short of its ambition on the night to win big majorities in several cities outside London. Birmingham and Leicester splitting right down the middle. Bradford voting pretty decisively to leave. Now, like all the other voters in the country, ethnic minority voters were answering the question on the ballot paper, Remain or leave. That was a question about the future, the pros and cons of staying in the EU club now. So it wasn't a referendum about whether we wanted to turn the clock back in our society to before 1972, to the society we had been before we joined the EEC. I think the rise in recorded hate crime since the referendum suggests that there are some people out there, a small minority, but a vocal and dangerous one, who do feel this was a vote to throw people out of our country, or one which gives them more permission to start to publicly express racist sentiments in public when those have become less legitimate over the years and decades that have gone. So I think those people need to be put very firmly back in their box. And that's another reason why I think a clear government guarantee to the 3 million European nationals in Britain is essential. We know it's a view very strongly shared by majorities of both Remain and Leave voters, but it's very important the government says that if we're to take away that voice from people who do think you can go around telling people they're going to be sent back as a result of this vote. What about the generation gap? Again, the referendum certainly divided Britain by age. But a large part of that big generation gap is actually about the distribution of education across the generations. There are many fewer older graduates, about 5% of the age group. But those who did go to university of that age were considerably more likely to vote for Remain, while among younger voters, those with the fewest educational qualifications who've left school earliest were much more likely to sit the referendum out or think about voting for leave. So age and social class were significant factors, but actually when you unpick it all, it turns out that your level of education is a considerably stronger one. What happened in this referendum was that Remain won the referendum in university land, but lost it elsewhere. It won the argument when it was talking to graduates, but couldn't find the messengers or the messengers who could make a persuasive case of benefits of the EU to blue-collar workers. One way to look at this is to look at about 100 parliamentary constituencies which host a university, like this one, about a sixth of the total. British Future has calculated that the average referendum result in those constituencies was 57% for Remain, not for Leave, and 43% for Leave, using Chris Hanratty's work on the constituency profile here at UAE. So the Norwich result, the 56% to vote to Remain here, is quite typical of this national picture in both its choice to leave, to Remain, and how that stands out from the rest of the vote across Norfolk, across East Anglia and the Eastern region. We can go just 20 miles east of here, and the proportion of voters preferring to leave the EU goes up 28%, from 44% in Norwich to 71.5% in Great Yarmouth. But we don't need to travel nearly so far out of the city to move from Planet Remain to Planet Leave, because Norwich itself was divided. 60% vote to Remain here in Norwich South, in the centre with the university, a majority for Leave in the Norwich North constituency, boosted by the stronger Leave vote in Broadlands. And there's an even more dramatic picture in the new ward-by-ward data just published last week, which some of you may have seen, painstakingly gathered by Martin Rosenbaum in his excellent BBC local referendum analysis. I don't know if you saw it, it was in the Eastern Daily Press, and it sort of looks like there's a map of America. You've got all the Remain places in the middle and, a bit more Leave on the edges of city. So, University Ward rather proudly says it represents Norwich because it was 56% Remain here. But Nelson Ward next door, 78% voting to Remain. You'll barely find a more pro-European place if you hunt right up and down the United Kingdom. Maybe the very centre of Cambridge could just about compete with it. But you only have to go 3, 4, or 5 miles across the city to find a solid 60% Leave vote over in Crome, so 38% higher, just 3 or 4 miles away. So I think these voting patterns across Norwich itself and across Norfolk, East Anglia and the Eastern region are actually the real referendum story of how this referendum divided Britain. It's not a simple caricatured story of London versus the rest, the capital and the provinces. It's much closer knit, patchwork polarisation. And I think if we think of it like this, much more up close and personal sense of local polarisation just up the road, then actually that might be something we're better placed to try and do something about. Now, there's one other referendum division that I think has had much too little attention. And this one isn't a division between the Leavers and the Remainers. It's one which unites the referendum partisans on both sides and sets them apart from their fellow citizens. And it's this difference in intensity about the referendum choice that explains why it became such a close, unpredictable, knife-edge decision. Both campaigns were very good indeed at talking to the minorities of the public who already agreed with them. But both sides struggled to understand those who didn't, and they didn't really know, on either side, quite how to answer the questions and doubts of people who were trying to make their minds up. Now, there's a very interesting referendum day poll by Lord Ashcroft. He didn't ask people just, how did you vote? He asked them, when did you make your minds up about the referendum? If you look at the results he gets, basically 6 million people on each side of the referendum give an answer that says, I always knew which side I was on once this vote was counted. But that's only 6 million on each side, and it ended up 16 million versus 17 million. So most people still wanted to hear both sides of the debate. They probably thought there was half a point on each side and wanted to hear more about their doubts as well before they voted. 4 out of 10 voters on both sides of the referendum say they decided how they would vote in the final 4 weeks ahead of June 23rd. 1 in 10 people on each side, 3 million people, say they decided which way to cast their vote on the day they went to the ballot box or filled in the postal vote. That must be a clue that the fear and loathing and mutual incomprehension of the Twitter wars and the Facebook arguments between the most ardent Remainers and Leavers was always a minority sport, probably mostly engaged in by those who knew very, very few people who were on the other side of the argument, except for maybe the odd Sunday lunch political row with the in-laws, when nobody could understand what the other side was thinking. There were people in this country for whom sovereignty in the EU have been the most important issue in every general election. We've been waiting for a referendum for 40 years since we had the last one. There were other people who Remain voters who thought the very idea of this referendum was taking a terrible unnecessary risk with a vital national interest. And both of those were minority views in the country out there. The mood in that final month, as millions of people were trying to decide what to do at school gates across Britain, certainly at the primary school gate where I was dropping off my kids, was very different. This referendum choice of 2016 did not feel much at all like the existential battle for the soul of the nation that the partisans on both sides thought it was. It felt like an important but really quite tricky democratic choice. What I heard more than anything else was, I'm definitely going to look into it a bit more before I finally decide, as the days ticked on and people were wondering what it was about. So for many voters, this referendum didn't feel at all like a proxy culture war about economic and social change across the last 40 years. It felt like a really difficult piece of homework where the Prime Minister and the Parliament had asked the voters to grapple with all these competing claims and counterclaims, what voters felt pretty sure were exaggerations on both sides, and to make up their mind about which was the best decision for the future of the country. And I think that sort of intensity gap in the referendum between the voters who decided it and the campaigns is something that is continuing now, I think, in the anxieties after the debate. So what happens now? Can we bridge the divides that the Brexit choice has shown us? There are different ideas, of course, even if we agree on the divisions, the different ideas about it. Some people are very fearful that the whole referendum itself and the aftermath have really opened up these divisions and made it worse. Other people, according to your politics, think it's an opportunity to start to address them. I think we need an agenda that speaks to people on both sides of this debate, and especially maybe those voters who sort of thought about which way they would tilt, about how we bring Britain together. Let me give you 3 ideas about how I think we need to do this. Firstly, I think more people need to get out of the referendum trenches. Brexit will be the biggest thing this country has done for over half a century. And I think getting that right will mean that people have to move on from the campaign that was won and lost in 2016. I don't think that's happened much in the last 9 months. I don't think we've seen much grace in victory from people who may be surprised that their side won. And I don't think we've had good losers or good winners after the referendum. But I don't think doing something this big, getting Brexit right and our future relationships to the European Union, could possibly be a project of the 52% or the 48% alone, still less the property of a single political party. I've heard a lot of calls for people to find the common ground. Whenever I look at them, they seem to come from a team that was all together on one side of the referendum, saying other people need to agree with me now. So I think we need to break that pattern and form new alliances that break out of those teams. I was involved in a recent Brexit Together manifesto, which had an equal number of people who'd supported Leave, supported Remain, or been on neither side. And people who were coming from the left and the right of politics, from think tanks, from the Adam Smith Institute, the Bright Blue, Liberal Conservative Group, the Fabian Society on the left. And we actually found we were able to identify several things that we thought were the content of a deal that most people could agree on. And the test, I think, is there a way of dealing with Brexit which makes sense to most people who voted Leave and most people who voted Remain, rather than feeling that it all goes to one side or the other. I think this will be a reset moment on immigration, and this will perhaps be one of the biggest issues to sort out in terms of what we do next. There's no doubt at all, I think, that Brexit is felt by the public to be a reset moment for our immigration policy in Britain. The referendum captured a loss of public confidence in how governments have handled this key issue over the last 15 years. What's much less clear is what choices are we now going to make about what immigration approach we have in the future. A lot of people see this as a very polarised debate and one in which finding common ground will be hardest. I think the challenge is to design an immigration system which does meet a public desire for greater control, while recognising that that needs to strike a balance between both the pressures and the gains of immigration, and that makes sense, I think, to people who are on both sides. So British Future, my organisation, is working with the Home Affairs Select Committee to hold a different kind of debate on immigration than the one we've had in the past. We're calling it a national conversation on immigration. We're also working with the charity Hope Not Hate. We're going to 60 towns and cities to host citizens' panels. We were in Bradford last week. We were in March in Cambridgeshire in the Fenlands last night. And everywhere we go, we're talking to people who are representative of the general public in that place, but also people who have a stake in the immigration debate, whether they're charities, civic groups, faith groups, businesses, to ask them, can we strike the common ground? How can we handle and manage immigration better? Some people will say we've had far too much debate about immigration already, or this is not a topic on which people will ever agree. But I think the outcome we've got now with the Leave vote changes the context. We don't need an immigration debate about why people have felt frustrated in the past, whichever side of the immigration debate you're on. But actually now it's about how can we put together a new system which might be able to secure greater public confidence in how, if we managed immigration well, it could benefit Britain. Another thing we need to do, which I know Eric will say some things about later, is talk about integration. And I think it's time to try and integrate the integration debates that we've got. One of the main points of Dame Louise Casey's recent view of integration in Britain is we've never really had a proactive integration strategy in this country at all, whether that's 40 or 50 years ago or today. And so the government have an opportunity to change that when they respond to the review this spring. But I want to know whether Sajid Javid, the Community Secretary, can actually integrate the different integration debates we have that seem to me to run on parallel tracks or lead parallel lives. We've had a debate about Brexit, about those who feel left behind by economic and cultural change. And we've also had a separate debate about parallel lives in diverse towns and cities in reviews like Ted Cantle's in the Mill Towns 15 years ago. These are often about the same themes of community relations, yet we seem to have a set of state of the nation identity and integration debates that themselves run on parallel tracks. We talk about the future of the United Kingdom, Scotland's place within it, English and Welsh identity at one point. We talk about how post-war immigration made us a multi-ethnic and multi-faith society, what we feel about the successes and failures of multiculturalism, the challenges of Islamist extremism or far-right extremism. And then separately, we talk about Brexit, the left behind, economic opportunity, class divisions, cultural inclusion. These are all debates about what it means to have a common citizenship, and I think we need to do more to bring them together. So Brexit, I think, has helpfully, perhaps, broadened our sense of what the debate about integration should be about. But that could now lead us to a series of contests. Which of these integration debate matters most? Which issue gets the attention, gets the resources of government? We might have competing grievances about whether integration is about a multi-ethnic and a multi-faith society or the left behind working classes. So I think it's really important to ask, how can we do what's long overdue to bring together these questions of ethnicity, faith, social class and identity in a coherent debate about what common citizenship, equal opportunities and a shared identity in Britain might mean. My final thought relates to what places like Norwich and places like this university can do in this context of a society that's more divided than the one we'd want to live in. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair observed a few years ago that politics is moving from a politics of left versus right, more to open versus closed. And he might well say that in a world of Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen and the debates we see across Europe and Brexit, that he was right about that. But I think this is a dangerous way to discuss the type of debate we need to have. Because declaring there's a foundational choice between open versus closed might be, for me, a really an ineffective way to defend important liberal values of openness and tolerance. What I think that can do is polarise our debates about identity, immigration and globalisation between two minority tribes in our society. The confident, forward-looking, more liberal graduate minority who feel more confident about a diverse society already, and an opposing minority who really are the people, the minority group, that would like to turn the clock back 40 years. And saying to people, it's just a choice, open versus closed, says very little, I think, to those people who are on the fence in the referendum, what I'd call a sceptical middle of our society, who will play an important role in the choices ahead. People who I think know we live in an increasingly global age, but feel the benefits of global engagement right now are too narrowly spread. I don't think it makes an offer to them. And without doing that, talking more to those concerns, will do too little to secure, I think, the public and political support for identity, immigration, openness that cities like this, universities like this, will need if they continue to thrive and engage confidently in a post-Brexit world. So for universities themselves, I think we are international is an important message to send to international staff on campus, to students, to partners abroad. But what's important as well is that shouldn't accidentally send a not in our name message of disassociation from audiences much closer to home. Because if university cities and towns seem to imply they see themselves almost as island outposts of cosmopolitan tolerance, perhaps apologising somehow for the democratic choices made by the citizens in the regions that they seek to serve, that would risk making universities themselves and the towns and cities they're in agents of polarisation in our society, not of the depolarisation we need. So I want to suggest that that patchwork polarisation of our referendum map presents an important opportunity, indeed a responsibility for our universities and cities and towns to work out how could they be more active agents of social depolarisation instead, close to home. We talked earlier about how the referendum map illustrates that cultural difference in a sense, I think, of confidence, control, voice and power. That, I think, is what risks separating Norwich from the rest of Norfolk. And that challenge exists in every region of Britain. It's the gap, I think, between Manchester and Wigan, between Newcastle and Sunderland and Hartlepool, between Cardiff and the Welsh Valleys, Exeter, Exmouth and everywhere to its west. So it is about, I think, the gap between Norwich and the wider region, but it's also about the gaps in confidence, control and power and voice within Norwich itself, or from the centre of Oxford to the east of the city, or between the university districts in the west of Bristol to the council estates to their south. I think doing more to address that gap would be the biggest contribution university cities could make towards a case for open being a more effective one. To succeed in that, I think it would depend on finding effective ways to link the role university cities have, crucial regional hubs of growth and of global exchange, with an ever more sustained visible commitment to ensuring those opportunities feel real, feel relevant and feel open to school leavers and parents in those places that most fear being left behind, even if they're just a few miles down the road. I want to say tonight that's the practical opportunity which could be taken up here in Norwich and East Anglia, just as it could in many other cities and regions, to start to do the practical work which could not reinforce the referendum divides, but knit together the patchwork polarisation of post-Brexit Britain. Thank you.